Welcome back, dear listeners, to another chilling night of true ghost stories. Tonight, we delve into the eerie experience of a man who had just been released from prison and found himself face to face with something beyond our understanding. A figure, silent and unmoving, appeared in his room one night, staring at the floor. Was it a figment of his tired mind? Or did he encounter a restless spirit? Settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare for a haunting tale that will stay with you long after the story ends. Story 1. When I got out of prison, I thought my biggest challenge would be readjusting to society, finding a job, and rebuilding my life. But I never expected my most difficult battle would come at night, alone. In my childhood bedroom, facing something that should not have been there. My name is Lucas Reed. I had spent 5 years behind bars for a crime I deeply regretted. And when I was finally released, I moved back in with my parents in their old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. The house was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, with no streetlights for miles. At night, the darkness outside was absolute, pressing in on the windows like a living thing. Adjusting to a normal routine was difficult. My sleep schedule was wrecked. I had secured a job at a factory, working the early morning shift. Every day, I woke up at 3 a.m., which meant I was usually asleep by 6 or 7 p.m. But sleep didn't come easy in that house. It had been so long since I had slept without the sounds of prison life, the constant murmurs, the distant footsteps, the occasional shouts. Now, I had nothing but silence and the whispering wind through the trees. That night started like any other. I lay in bed, watching an old movie on TV, hoping it would lull me to sleep. The flickering light from the screen cast strange shadows on the walls. But I had grown used to them. The house was too quiet otherwise. I turned over to face the wall, my body heavy with exhaustion. My eyelids drooped. Just as I was about to slip into sleep, I felt the urge to use the bathroom. Annoyed, I rolled onto my back, and my blood turned to ice. In the corner of my room, near the closet, stood a young man. He was still, motionless, staring at the floor, my breath caught in my throat. Even in the dim glow of the TV, I could make out every detail of him. He had blonde hair, neatly cut, and a pale complexion. He wore a navy blue hoodie with the front pocket where both his hands were tucked in, tan-colored pants, and dark shoes. He wasn't moving. He wasn't making a sound. For a few seconds, I just stared, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I wanted to scream, to bolt out of bed, but fear held me frozen. I squeezed my eyes shut, thinking maybe I was just overtired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. When I opened them again, he was still there. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I don't know how long I lay there, barely breathing, willing him to disappear. Then, gathering every ounce of courage I had, I did something I can't explain. I rolled back over, turning my back to him. Why? Maybe it was some primal instinct, some misguided belief that if I ignored him, he would go away. But the moment I turned, the terror hit me like a tidal wave. My muscles finally obeyed. I launched myself out of bed and sprinted down the hallway, my feet barely touching the floor. I burst into the living room, gasping. My parents, who had been watching the news, looked up in shock. "What the hell, Lucas?" my father barked. "There's someone in my room," I panted. My mother frowned, glancing toward the hallway. "What are you talking about?" "A man. A guy. He's just standing there, in the corner." My father grabbed his shotgun from behind the couch. And together, we crept back to my room. My hands shook as I flipped on the overhead light. Nothing. The room was empty. The corner where the figure had stood was bare. No sign that anyone had been there. My bed was just as I had left it. The TV still flickering away. My father lowered his gun with a scowl. "Damn it, boy, you scared the hell out of us. I swear I saw him," I whispered, my voice weak. My mother gave me a look filled with concern. "Lucas, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe it was a dream." But I knew better. It wasn't a dream. I hadn't been asleep yet. And deep down, I knew I wasn't alone in that room. For weeks after that night, I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes, I would wake up to the feeling of someone standing over me. But when I turned on the light, no one was there. I stopped sleeping with the TV off. I stopped closing my closet door, afraid of what might be behind it. One night, I finally broke down and did some research. I dug into old records, local news archives, anything that might explain what I had seen. And then I found it. 30 years ago, a boy named Daniel Carter had gone missing in the woods behind our property. He was never found. His parents searched for years. But eventually, they moved away. Some believed he had run away. Others whispered about something darker. When I found an old, grainy photograph of Daniel, my stomach dropped. The boy in the picture had blonde hair, pale skin, and he was wearing a navy blue hoodie. I don't know why he appeared to me that night. I don't know if he was trying to tell me something, or if he was just stuck. But I do know one thing. I never slept soundly in that house again. Ghost stories like these remind us that some things defy explanation. Was the figure I saw the restless spirit of Daniel Carter? Or was it just a fragment of my exhausted mind? I may never know for sure. But one thing is certain. Some places hold onto their ghosts. And sometimes, they choose to show themselves to those who are willing to see them. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, sleep well, if you can. Story 2. There are moments in life when the past refuses to stay buried. When history reaches out through the thin veil of time and leaves an indelible mark on the present. We grow up hearing ghost stories, tales of wandering spirits, eerie whispers in the night, and haunted objects, but we often dismiss them as mere figments of imagination. But what if one night, you had an encounter that left no room for doubt? What if a long-lost ancestor stepped out of history and into your reality? This is exactly what happened to me one fateful night when I was just a child. A night I will never forget. I must have been about 8 years old when my mother decided to decorate my bedroom with old family portraits. She had spent the day rummaging through the attic, sifting through dust-covered relics of our lineage, and returned with 2 solemn-looking pictures. One was of a woman in a lace dress, her eyes dark and piercing, staring into the abyss of time. The other was of a man dressed in a Civil War uniform, his expression stern and unreadable. My mother said they were my great-great-grandparents. "This is Elizabeth," she had said, pointing to the woman. "And this, well, I'm not sure of his name, but he was a soldier." I remember staring at the picture for a long time before my mother finally hung it up on my wall. There was something unsettling about his gaze, something almost alive in the way his eyes followed me around the room. But I didn't say anything. I was too young to question these things, too young to understand the weight of history pressing down on me. That night, As I lay in bed, a strange coldness settled over me. The room, which had been warm and cozy just moments before, suddenly felt as though an icy wind had swept through it. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my skin prickled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, the temperature dropped even further. I tried to sit up, but my body felt frozen in place. Panic surged through me, and then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. A shadow moved in the dim glow of my nightlight, forming the shape of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a uniform that looked eerily familiar. It was him, the man in the portrait. My heart pounded against my ribs as the apparition took a step closer. But the moment our eyes met, the fear that had gripped me like a vice slowly dissipated. There was something in his expression, an odd sense of recognition. As if he knew me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a single word escaped my lips. "Who are you?" The ghost hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice deep and distant, like an echo from another era. "Caleb." The name reverberated through the room, and a strange calm settled over me. Somehow, it felt familiar. We talked after that. About what? I can't recall. The conversation felt oddly natural, like speaking to a long-lost relative at a family gathering. I remember asking questions, and he answered them, though his responses were slow, measured, like he was struggling to find the words after centuries of silence. He told me he had fought in the war and never returned home. He had died alone, on a battlefield far from everything he had ever known. His voice carried sadness, but there was also a hint of relief that someone finally knew his story. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the golden light of morning. The room was warm again, the eerie chill from the night before completely gone. But the memory of the encounter lingered, vivid and undeniable. I rushed downstairs to tell my mother about the dream. At first, she listened patiently, nodding along, but when I reached the part about his name, her face drained of all color. "Caleb?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. She stood there, silent, her hand covering her mouth. And then, finally, she said, "That was his name. Your great-great-grandfather's name was Caleb." A shiver ran down my spine. I had never heard that name before. My mother had never mentioned it. And yet, somehow, I had known. That evening, my mother retrieved an old box from the attic. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, written in elegant cursive. They were from Caleb, sent to his wife before he vanished from history. My mother and I read them together, and with every word, I felt the presence of his ghost lingering in the air, as if he was still with us, waiting for someone to remember him. I glanced back up at the portrait, my great-great-grandfather staring back at me with that same solemn expression. But now, it didn't feel eerie or unsettling. It felt familiar, like an old friend watching over me from beyond the veil. Some people would say it was just a dream, a trick of the mind. Others might call it a coincidence. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That night, history stepped into the present, and for a brief moment, the past was no longer just something written in books or captured in faded photographs. It was real, it was alive, and I, a mere child, had been given the rarest of gifts, a conversation with a ghost from my own bloodline. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was all he ever wanted, to be remembered. Story 3. Some houses hold secrets. Some whispers never fade. And some shadows linger long after the lights go out. What you're about to hear is a true account from someone who lived through it. A story that will make you question what really resides in the places we call home. Sit back, turn off the lights if you dare, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. I have been living in this house for 6 years now. When I first moved here, I was just 6 years old. It was an old but charming house in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place that looked warm and inviting during the day but carried an eerie stillness at night. At first, it felt like any other home, a place filled with new beginnings and childhood adventures. But soon, something changed. The shadows came. At first, they were fleeting, like the tricks of the light. I would see something move from the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I thought it was just my imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the shadows grew bolder. I saw them standing in doorways, slipping down hallways, lingering just long enough for me to know they were real. I told my parents. I expected them to dismiss it, to tell me it was just my young mind playing tricks on me. Instead, they looked at each other with the kind of understanding that sent chills down my spine. We see them too, my mother admitted. They did some research, asking around the neighborhood about the house's history. It turned out that an old man had lived and died here. He had no family, no friends, just an empty house to keep him company until the end. Maybe he had never left. In hopes of bringing peace to both us and him, we had the house blessed. A priest came, walked through every room, murmuring prayers as he sprinkled holy water on the walls and floors. For a little while, things seemed to calm. The air felt lighter. The shadows retreated, but they never truly left. One evening, I was in the kitchen with my little sister, Lily. She was playing with her favorite toy, a small, stuffed pony she took everywhere. Out of nowhere, she let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned, heart pounding. What happened? I asked. She pointed to the far side of the room, her tiny hands trembling. It flew, she whispered. It flew across the room. The pony, which had been in her grasp just moments before, was now lying in the corner, as if it had been thrown. There was no one else in the room. No gust of wind, no logical explanation. The unease settled back into our home, heavier than before. 2 nights ago, I was playing on my old PS2, trying to distract myself from the feeling of being watched. It was late. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the game console. And then, I felt it, the sensation of eyes boring into me. I turned to the doorway. There he was, an old man, standing just beyond the threshold, watching me. His figure was faint, almost translucent, but his eyes were sharp, filled with something I couldn't quite name. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he simply stood there, staring. And just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. I barely slept that night. And then came yesterday, the final sign that whatever was in this house was not content with being ignored. I was sitting by my bedroom window, looking out at our backyard. The sun had set, and the yard was bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. That's when I saw him, running. A man, dressed in all white, darting through the backyard. He moved too fast, his motions unnatural, as if he were gliding rather than running. He vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of his presence in my mind. The following night, my father and I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, we stepped outside. The grass was cold beneath our feet as we made our way toward the back fence. My father called out, "Who's there?" But silence was our only answer. We checked every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the eerie sense of being watched. That same night, as I lay in bed, I heard something strange, a faint, rhythmic tapping against my bedroom window. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. A shadowed figure stood just outside, its face pressed against the glass. I bolted upright, flipping on my bedside lamp. But by the time the light flooded the room, it was gone. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt below my window. They led nowhere. Days passed, and the disturbances continued. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. One evening, my mother swore she heard someone whisper her name just inches from her ear while she was alone in the kitchen. My father, a man who never believed in ghosts, woke up one night gasping for air, as if unseen hands had pressed against his chest. We reached a breaking point. A second priest was called, and this time, he did more than bless the house. He performed a ritual meant to cleanse lingering spirits. As he prayed, he suddenly stopped and turned to us. "Whatever is here, it does not wish to leave." It has been years since that night. The house is quieter now, but I still see them sometimes, the shadows. They no longer stand in doorways or run through the backyard, but they watch, always watching. We were never alone in this house. We never will be. Some hauntings are subtle, like a whisper in the dark. Others make their presence known in ways you can't ignore. This house, this entity, was one that refused to be forgotten. It started with shadows, but soon, it made itself known in every way possible. Was it the old man who had lived here before? Or was it something else? Something older and more restless? I may never know, but I do know this. Sometimes, when you think you're alone, you aren't, and sometimes, the shadows watch back. Story 4. There are places in this world that hold onto memories long after the people who lived in them have gone. Some houses breathe, their wooden frames expanding and contracting with the seasons, their walls soaked with whispers from the past. I have always believed that a house, no matter how old, can remember. This is the story of one such house, one that I lived in as a child. It stood in a quiet town nestled along the rocky coastline of Maine. An old house with its own secrets. I never learned its history, and I doubt I ever will. But there was something about it that made you feel like you were never truly alone. It was an unspoken presence. Something felt rather than seen. The house was a modest two-story structure, with 4 bedrooms, a creaky wooden staircase, and a basement that always seemed colder than it should have been. But the strangest events always seemed to take place in the kitchen. The front entrance was peculiar in itself. It had 2 doors, an outer heavy wooden door with a glass window, and then the actual front door. The way they were positioned, you had to push hard to open the first door before stepping onto a small enclosed porch leading to the front door. Yet, no matter how often we checked the locks, our front door would sometimes swing open. The outside door, however, remained firmly shut. We had a simple kitchen light, one of those old fluorescent ones with a pull-string mechanism. My mother, to make it easier for us kids, tied a piece of yarn to the metal pull chain. But every night, like clockwork, the string would move on its own. You could actually watch it being pulled, as if an unseen hand was turning the light on and off. It became such a regular occurrence that we no longer found it frightening. Even our friends, who would visit and witness it firsthand, simply accepted it as part of the house's quirks. Despite the odd happenings, the presence in the house never felt malevolent. In fact, it seemed caring. In its own way. On hot summer nights, we children would fall asleep with our windows open and our blankets kicked to the foot of the bed. By morning, we would wake up to find the windows closed and ourselves tucked neatly under our blankets. None of us ever woke up during the night, and our parents assured us they weren't the ones doing it. For reasons I can't explain, my family and I all came to believe that the spirit in our house was an old woman. We never saw her, never heard her speak, but there was something distinctly feminine about her presence. It was as if she had taken it upon herself to watch over us, ensuring that we were safe and warm while we slept. There were other small occurrences too. The scent of lavender would sometimes waft through the halls late at night. Despite no flowers in the house, soft humming, almost like a lullaby, could be heard when the house was otherwise silent, and there were times when a rocking chair in the corner of the living room would move gently back and forth on its own, as if someone unseen was sitting there, watching over us. Then came the day when something happened that changed how we viewed our ghostly resident. My mother went into the kitchen one evening, reaching to turn on the light using the yarn we had attached to the pull string. The moment she pulled it, a jolt of electricity shot through her arm so intensely that she collapsed to her knees. I have never heard of anyone getting electrocuted by a piece of yarn before. Neither had my father, nor anyone we spoke to after. But it happened, and for the first time, we questioned whether the presence in the house was truly harmless. After that, the playful antics, the moving light string, the mysteriously closed windows, seemed to carry an edge of something else. Something less friendly. We no longer saw it as simply an old woman watching over us. We couldn't shake the feeling that maybe we had overstayed our welcome. Then, one night, something happened that none of us could explain away. My older sister, who had always been skeptical about ghosts, woke up screaming. She said she had felt cold, bony fingers brush against her cheek as she slept. When she turned on the bedside lamp, there was no one there, but the rocking chair in the corner of her room was moving, as if someone had just stood up from it. That was the final straw for my parents. Within a month, we packed up and left. It wasn't long before we moved away. We never experienced anything like that in our new home. Whatever lived in that house in Maine stayed there, as if it was tied to the walls and the old wooden floors. Years later, out of curiosity, I tried to look up any history on the house. I never found much, but what little I did uncover was unsettling. An elderly woman had once lived there alone for decades. She was known for keeping to herself, rarely seen by neighbors. One night, during a particularly harsh winter, she was found dead in her rocking chair, wrapped in a heavy quilt, as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Could it have been her? Had she simply continued watching over the house she had called home for so many years? Or had we just been unwelcome guests in a space that she still believed was hers? Looking back, I wonder, was she truly benevolent? Or was she simply waiting for the right moment to remind us that the house was hers? Some houses remember, and some spirits never leave. The story of the old house in Maine is one that has stayed with me throughout my life. Was it truly a ghost? Or was it something our minds conjured from the creaks and groans of an old home? Logic suggests one answer, but experience whispers another. What I do know is this: if you ever feel like you're not alone in a place, perhaps you should trust that feeling. Not every unseen presence means harm, but not all are as innocent as they seem either. Story 5. There are nights when the veil between our world and something beyond feels thinner than usual. When shadows stretch a little longer, and the air carries a strange weight that you can't quite explain. What if I told you that sometimes, in the still of the night, things move unseen, yet leave behind undeniable traces of their presence? Tonight, I'm going to share with you a story of one such night, a night filled with knocks in the dark, chilling whispers, and something watching from the corners of our home. It all started just last night, at around 8:30 p.m. My wife, Lily, had dozed off on the couch, her soft snoring a steady background hum in our dimly lit living room. My 13-year-old son, Nathan, and I were sitting together, watching a show called The Hollow. The night was peaceful, quiet, and ordinary until the knocking started. The sound was distinct, like knuckles rapping against solid wood. Each knock was spaced evenly, about 2 to 3 seconds apart. Nathan and I both jerked in our seats, staring at each other wide-eyed before breaking into nervous laughter. Perhaps it was just the house settling? Maybe a branch tapping against the window? We reassured ourselves with logical explanations and returned to watching our show. But 5 minutes later, as we were mid-conversation about the strange noise, it happened again. This time, the knocks were sharper, more deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, was making its presence known. Still, after checking the front door and the windows, we found nothing. No movement outside, no rustling branches, just the silence of the night pressing in around us. 15 minutes passed before the next strange occurrence. I felt an urge to use the restroom, so I got up and walked down the hallway. The house was old, and the floorboards creaked under my weight as I made my way past dimly lit rooms. I took care of business and was just stepping out of the bathroom when I heard it, a noise from directly behind me. A soft shuffle, like the rustling of fabric. My breath caught in my throat. The bathroom mirror reflected only my own pale face, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier. Nathan was staring at me as I stepped back into the living room. His face was serious, his voice low when he spoke. "Just think, you were in there with that." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Despite our growing unease, the night continued as usual. An hour passed, and I was getting up to return to the bathroom when Nathan let out a long, drawn-out "ooh." His eyes were fixed on something in the room, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. My heart pounded as I turned back. "What is it?" I asked, my voice more cautious than I intended. He pointed toward the darkened hallway. "Did you see that?" "See what?" He described it, a floating, fluorescent orb, roughly the size of a softball, hovering briefly before vanishing. My stomach twisted with a sick realization. Whatever had been making its presence known was now visible. I sat back down, scanning the room. Minutes passed, and then, I saw one. Smaller this time, no larger than a quarter. Drifting in the air with a faint tail behind it. It was only there for a few seconds before fading into the dark. We stayed frozen in place, waiting, but the orbs never returned. And just as suddenly as it all began, the strange occurrences ceased. It was over, or so we thought. There was a reason this entire event left an unsettling feeling in my gut. You see, this wasn't the first time. 3 months ago, my son had experienced something eerily similar. That night, he had fallen asleep on the couch when a noise woke him. He didn't investigate, just pulled the covers over his head, hoping whatever it was would go away. Then, something hit him, hard. He had come running into our bedroom, breathless and panicked. "Mom, Dad, come here now." We rushed to see what had happened. And he showed us his arm. There, on his skin, was a fresh bruise, as if something had struck him. But this time, there was something else. Nathan hesitated before telling me the whole story. He said that before he was hit, he had felt something cold press against his forehead, like an icy fingertip tracing his skin. Then, a whisper, a voice that wasn't quite human, murmuring something he couldn't understand. It was low, guttural, and sent a wave of dread through his body before he felt the impact on his arm. I hadn't known that part before. And now, after last night, it was clear that whatever had been here before was back. That night, after Nathan went to bed, I stayed up, listening. Every small creak, every faint noise set my nerves on edge. Then, just past 3 a.m., I heard it again. A single knock, then another, and another. This time, they came from the walls. Slow and deliberate, the air turned icy, and a shadow flickered just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Some say spirits linger in places they once called home, while others believe entities are drawn to people, not just locations. What happened in our house was no mere coincidence. The knocking, the voices, the orbs, it was a warning. A presence trying to communicate, or worse, trying to interact. If this happens again, I don't think we'll be so quick to dismiss it. But what if we're not the ones deciding? What if, next time, it decides not to stop? Have you ever experienced something similar? Perhaps a knock in the night or a touch from an unseen hand? If so, you're not alone. Some things go beyond explanation, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. Story 6. There are stories that linger in the shadows, whispered among friends on cold nights, shared in hushed tones as if speaking them too loudly would invite something unseen into the room. Some tales are mere folklore, born of overactive imaginations and the eerie play of light against the darkness. But others have roots buried deep in reality. This is one of those stories. I had just returned home from visiting my cousin, the evening settling into the eerie stillness of night. With a sigh, I tossed my bag onto my bed and pulled out my phone. Eager to chat, as I spoke, my fingers absent-mindedly shuffled through the clutter in my closet. That's when I felt it. A presence. The air thickened around me, charged with something unseen but undoubtedly there. I turned sharply, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. One of my collectibles, a small porcelain figurine from my childhood, lifted into the air, as if held by invisible hands. My breath hitched, my mind struggled to rationalize. But before I could move, the doll shot across the room, crashing violently against the wall, shattering into jagged shards. The sound was deafening in the silence that followed. Terror surged through me. Without thinking, I bolted out of my room, my scream ripping through the house as I ran downstairs to my father. For months, nothing happened. The house fell into an uneasy quiet, the incident fading into the back of my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Until, suddenly, the nights turned restless. It started at exactly 11 p.m. A faint noise, soft, almost rhythmic. Footsteps. They ascended and descended the staircase in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if someone unseen was pacing. Then, the steps quickened, turning into frantic running. The sound of impact followed, a heavy, sickening thud, as though something was slamming against the walls. At first, I thought I was imagining things. That is, until I replayed a voicemail on my phone. In the background, beneath my own voice, there was something else. A whisper. A voice. Raspy. Distant. But unmistakably clear. "Get out of my house." My skin went cold. One afternoon, my cousin and I left school early and came to my house for a quick meal. We were in my room when the front door creaked open downstairs. "Did you hear that?" my cousin asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, pulse racing. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed up the stairs. My dog, usually a fearless ball of energy, started growling. But this wasn't an ordinary growl. It was low, guttural, filled with a terror that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then came the yelp, sharp and pained, as if something had struck it. The footsteps reached my bedroom door. The handle twisted and rattled violently. Someone, or something, desperately trying to get in. My cousin and I froze, too afraid to move. Then came the whistle, a low, eerie sound that slithered through the air like a serpent. With trembling hands, my cousin grabbed her phone, dialing her boyfriend. The line connected, but before she could speak, another voice cut in. "Leave, now." The call dropped. The temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath fogged in the air, despite the heater running full blast. She redialed. This time, her boyfriend answered. We barely managed to choke out the words before we grabbed our things and bolted. As we dashed down the stairs, we passed the living room. My cat was there, his tail puffed to twice its normal size, his body rigid with terror. The front door was shut. We yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in. We pounded against the wood, desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the door swung open. We didn't hesitate. We ran. Even now, long after that night, the house still holds onto its secrets. The footsteps persist. The whispers remain. We've sought help, priests, blessings, prayers, but some things, it seems, refuse to leave. The strange occurrences did not stop. A few weeks later, I was home alone, studying in my room, when the air shifted. It was the same heavy feeling I had experienced before, pressing against my chest. Then, the closet door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. I stared, frozen. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I forced myself to stand, to look inside. The closet was empty except for my clothes. But something felt wrong. As I backed away, the overhead light flickered and went out, plunging my room into darkness. And then, from inside the closet, came the faintest sound, a whisper. I didn't wait. I ran straight out of the house. Days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sensation of something pressing down on my chest. My body felt paralyzed, my breathing shallow. Shadows moved in the corner of my room, darker than the night itself. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. I could hear the sound of fabric rustling, as if unseen hands were brushing against my bed. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the weight lifted. I gasped for air, my heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat. My cousin and I decided we needed to do something. We spoke to a local priest, who agreed to bless the house. The night before the blessing, I had a final encounter. I was lying in bed when my closet door burst open violently, hitting the wall with a deafening bang. My curtains flapped wildly as though caught in a storm, though the windows were shut. And then, a shadow moved, a figure, indistinct, tall, menacing. It lingered for only a moment before vanishing into the darkness. Not all hauntings come with blood-stained walls or flickering lights. Some manifest in whispers, in footsteps that belong to no one, in doors that refuse to open until fear reaches its peak. Was it a spirit, a residual presence unwilling to let go? Or something far worse, something that never truly left? Sometimes, the scariest part of a story isn't the ghost. It's knowing that the story isn't over. Story 7. There are moments in life when the veil between our world and the unknown seems to thin. Some dismiss these experiences as mere figments of an overactive imagination, while others recognize them as something more, something unexplainable yet undeniably real. What you're about to hear is not just another ghost story. It is an account of a lingering presence that defies reason. A presence that refused to be forgotten. When I was a little girl, I had an imaginary friend. Like many children, I created a companion to share my days with. Someone to talk to when no one else was around. I named her Lena. She was always there, watching, listening, playing. My mother never questioned it. She knew that children often invent imaginary friends. And she believed I would eventually outgrow her. But Lena was different. As I grew older and started school, I began to make real friends. The games of make-believe that once occupied my days started to lose their appeal. I remember standing in my bedroom one evening and telling Lena that I didn't need her anymore. I expected her to simply fade away, as imaginary friends do. She didn't. No matter how many times I told her to leave, she stayed. It was as if she refused to be dismissed. Her presence became suffocating. I would wake in the middle of the night feeling her near, whispering words I couldn't understand. I was terrified, but my mother, unaware of the depth of my fear, simply reassured me. Just tell her to leave, she said, and if she won't go, I will come upstairs and tell her myself. So I did. I marched upstairs, my heart pounding, and demanded that Lena leave me alone. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that she hadn't gone. My mother came up as promised and firmly told her to leave. I told my mother it hadn't worked. She just tucked me into bed and said, "We'll try again tomorrow." That night, Lena tormented me. She whispered my name, tugged at my blankets, and kept me awake for hours. Frustrated and exhausted, I finally decided to ignore her completely. That was when she left. For years, I didn't think of Lena. Life moved on. I finished school, made new friends, and eventually, she became nothing more than a distant childhood memory. Or so I thought. Years later, when I turned 18, I traveled to England to visit my grandmother and extended family. One afternoon, while flipping through an old family photo album with my aunt, I came across a picture of a little girl. There was something hauntingly familiar about her. It was as if I had seen her before, though I couldn't recall where. "Who is this?" I asked my aunt, pointing at the picture. She smiled wistfully. "That's Eleanor, my cousin. She passed away when she was just 8 years old." A chill ran through me. What was her full name? Eleanor Genevieve. My aunt paused. We used to call her Lena. I felt my blood run cold. I told my aunt about my childhood imaginary friend, how I had called her Lena and how she had refused to leave. My aunt's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, understanding. My family had always been deeply spiritual. and she believed that Eleanor had visited me, reaching out across time and death. When I returned to the States, I told my sister about my discovery. We hadn't grown up together, as she had lived with our father. To my astonishment, she went pale. I had an imaginary friend too, she admitted. I called her Elle. She was always with me. I thought she was just something my mind had made up. But now, her voice trailed off, the pieces of an eerie puzzle falling into place. I shared the story with my cousin, who had grown up in a different city entirely. She too had an imaginary friend, one she called General. We all believed it was the same little girl. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a coincidence, an odd twist of fate that we had all imagined the same thing. But deep down, I knew better. The memories came rushing back, the way Lena refused to leave. How she had whispered to me in the dead of night. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I started having nightmares. I would wake up to the sensation of someone standing over me. Shadows shifting in the corners of my room. At times, I would hear faint whispers, so distant I could almost believe they weren't real. Almost. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it clearly. My name. A child's voice. Barely above a whisper. I turned on my light, my heart pounding. The room was empty, but on my nightstand, an old photograph album sat open to the very page where Eleanor's picture had been. Had I left it there? Had someone else? I tried to push it from my mind, to tell myself it was just a trick of my imagination. But the whispers continued. And then, one night, I saw her. It was only for a second, a fleeting glimpse of a small figure standing at the foot of my bed. Dark hair, pale face, wide, empty eyes staring at me before she vanished into the darkness. I was frozen in terror. I wanted to believe it was a dream, a sleep-deprived hallucination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I never saw her clearly again. But I felt her, a presence lingering in the shadows, just beyond the edges of perception. Some might find comfort in the thought that she had only wanted to play, to connect with us, her distant family. But even now, as I recount this story, I can't shake the feeling that she never truly left. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear the faintest whisper of my name, and when I turn to look, there is no one there. Imaginary friends are often dismissed as mere childhood fantasies. But what if they are something more? What if they are echoes of souls left behind? Spirits yearning for companionship? The story of Lena, Eleanor Genevieve, suggests that some connections transcend the barriers of life and death. Perhaps, not all imaginary friends are imaginary after all. Story 8. Fear often comes softly, like a whisper carried on the wind. It creeps into our lives unnoticed, settling in the quiet moments, in the spaces between reality and something darker. At first, we ignore it, dismiss it as imagination, but then it lingers, growing heavier with each passing day, until the truth becomes impossible to deny. This is my story, a story about the things my daughter sees, things I cannot. My daughter, Evelyn, just turned 3 last week. For a while now, I've had this unsettling feeling that she sees things the rest of us cannot. It started off innocently enough, tiny moments I dismissed as childhood imagination. But lately, I can't shake the feeling that something unseen lingers in our home. At night, when I tuck Evelyn into her crib, she begins to talk, not the usual toddler babble, but full conversations, as if someone were right there with her. Her little voice fills the dim room, animated and cheerful, pausing every now and then as if she's listening. I've asked her who she's talking to, but she just giggles and says, "The funny lady." During the day, while she's playing in her pen, she does something strange. She spins in circles, hands raised above her head, laughing as if someone were holding her up and twirling her. It's unsettling, like an unseen force is lifting her in play. My husband, Daniel, brushed it off at first, chalking it up to toddler energy. But the way she laughs, it's different. It's directed toward something, or someone. Then came the moment that made my stomach drop. We were in the living room one evening, watching Finding Nemo. A rare moment of calm with our newborn son. Noah, nestled in my arms. Evelyn, as toddlers do, suddenly decided to run off down the hallway. I sighed, pushing myself up to go after her before she could reach the bathroom. But before I could even take a step, she let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard from her before, pure terror. She turned, bolting straight for me, her tiny feet pounding against the wooden floor. She crashed into my legs, clutching them tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded as I knelt down to her level, trying to calm her. "Baby, what's wrong? What did you see?" I asked. Her face twisted into something dark, her usually soft features contorted into an expression of sheer anger. Her tiny hands clenched into fists as she growled, "The bad man." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. "What bad man?" She only shook her head, burying her face in my shoulder. Her little body trembled against mine, her breath hot and uneven. That night, Daniel and I lay in bed, wide awake, the baby monitor between us crackling softly with the sound of Evelyn breathing in her crib. "Do you think the house is haunted?" I finally whispered. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but whatever she saw, it wasn't good." In the following days, I watched my daughter closely. She avoided the hallway whenever possible, refusing to go near it alone. Her once cheerful conversations with the funny lady grew shorter. More reluctant, sometimes, she would suddenly stop mid-sentence, frown, and shake her head, as if something had changed. I began noticing other things too, subtle, yet unmistakable. The temperature in certain rooms would drop inexplicably. Shadows seemed to linger just a second too long in the corners of my vision. Noah, barely a few months old, would sometimes stare at something beyond us, his tiny hands grasping at empty air. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of Evelyn's soft crying. Rushing to her room, I found her sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. "He's in the closet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel, now more skeptical than ever, strode toward the closet and yanked open the door. Empty. But as he turned back toward us, I saw something. Something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, darker than the room itself, slipped along the edge of the doorframe before vanishing. Daniel didn't see it, but I did. The following morning, I decided to visit our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. When I hesitantly asked if she had ever heard of anything strange happening in our home, her expression turned grim. "That house? Oh, honey, there's a reason it stayed empty for so long. A man used to live there years ago, a mean, angry man, died right there in the hallway. Some say he never left." Chills crawled up my spine. When I got home, I found Evelyn sitting quietly in the living room, staring toward the hallway. "He doesn't like you talking about him, Mama," she murmured. That was when I knew we were not alone in this house. I wanted to believe she would grow out of it, that whatever was happening would fade as she got older. But I couldn't shake the gnawing fear at the back of my mind. If Evelyn could see them now, what if Noah could too? This story is one of many that mothers and fathers have shared over the years. Stories of children seeing and interacting with things that defy logic. Some believe children are more attuned to the spiritual world, their innocence allowing them to perceive what adults have long forgotten. Others dismiss such encounters as simple imagination, a trick of the mind. But what if they aren't just stories? What if, just beyond the veil of what we perceive, something else is watching? And what happens when it decides to reach back? Have you ever experienced something similar? If so, you're not alone. Story 9. There are stories that stick with you, lingering in your mind long after they have ended. Some are terrifying, some are fascinating, but then there are those that are just plain frustrating. This is one such story, the story of the ghost that won't leave me alone. A presence that, despite my best efforts to ignore, keeps making itself known in the most irritating of ways. I call him Howard. Howard isn't the kind of ghost that slams doors or whispers eerie threats in the night. He's the kind that thrives on small, inexplicable disturbances, the kind that makes you question your own sanity. Missing objects, fleeting shadows, strange noises at the most inconvenient times, hallucinations, premonitions, nightmares. Howard has a way of making sure I never truly feel at ease in my own home. Here, I'll recount two of the most bizarre encounters I've had with him in the past 2 weeks. It was late at night when I returned home, slipping quietly through the front door of my house on Elmwood Street. The place was still and silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I had stayed out later than I intended, and the last thing I wanted was to wake anyone up. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I moved cautiously upward, avoiding the areas I knew would betray my presence. I reached for the light switch but hesitated. Something about the darkness felt oppressive, as if I wasn't alone. The hallway leading to the basement was always dimly lit, the glow from the laundry room casting eerie shadows on the walls. More than once, I had seen something. Someone, lurking at the edge of that light. A figure that stretched unnaturally long across the floor, disappearing the moment I tried to confront it. The first time I had seen Howard's shadow, I dismissed it as a trick of the light. But then it happened again, and again, always from the same spot, always retreating into the darkness when I approached. That night, I had an uneasy feeling as I made my way to the bathroom. The small space was illuminated by the harsh glow of the overhead bulb. I turned on the sink and splashed cold water on my face. But when I looked up, I nearly jumped out of my skin. In the mirror's reflection, a figure darted out of the room behind me. I spun around instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. But there was no one there. Just the quiet house, undisturbed except for my own erratic breathing. Something about the incident left me shaken. But I told myself I was imagining things. That was until I returned to my bedroom and glanced at the television. A moment ago, it had been playing a true crime documentary. But now, staring back at me from the screen, was a grotesque, bloodied face with hollow black eyes. My stomach twisted in fear as the image flickered for a second, then dissolved into static. A moment later, the program returned as if nothing had happened. That was Howard's way of reminding me that he was still here. The second incident happened just a few days later. I was on the phone with my friend, Melissa, the only person I'd ever confided in about Howard. As we spoke, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. The upstairs phone had been picked up. For a second, I held my breath, listening. Then, through the receiver, a harsh, wheezing cough echoed in my ear. Guahar, Guahar. I nearly dropped the phone. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Hear what? Melissa asked, sounding confused. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't heard it. The sound had only come through my end of the call. I raced upstairs, expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows. But when I reached the phone in the hallway, the only thing there was my cat, curled up peacefully in her usual chair. Is someone else there? I asked cautiously. No, Melissa replied. My hands were trembling. Was I really losing my mind? Desperate for answers, I decided to conduct an experiment. In the small hidden compartment in my bathroom, a place where I had inexplicably found missing items before, I left a note. I want answers, I wrote. Write on the line below and get back to me. Either answer me or get out of my house. I left a pen beside it and shut the compartment. The next morning, I checked it, half hoping, half dreading what I might find. The note had been altered, but not with words. A series of small dots covered the line beneath my message. Not random scribbles, but something deliberate, a pattern. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I knew one thing for certain, I hadn't made those marks. Since that night, strange occurrences have only increased. Small things, barely noticeable but undeniably present. My keys moving from where I left them. My shoes facing the wrong direction. A persistent tapping noise on the walls just as I'm about to fall asleep. Howard's games never stop, and they seem to be getting bolder. I've tried everything to prove Howard's existence to someone else. I've considered using my video camera to catch him on film or setting up a tape recorder to capture any abnormal sounds. But so far, I have no definitive proof, just an overwhelming sense that something is always watching me. I don't know what Howard wants. I don't know who he was, or why he's chosen to haunt me of all people. But I do know one thing. He isn't terrifying. He isn't fascinating. He's just annoying. And I wish he would leave me alone. Story 10. I never considered myself a believer in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and eerie encounters were nothing more than the figments of overactive imaginations. Stories told to scare children around a campfire. But that was before my husband and I moved into Willow Creek House. Now, 8 months later, I find myself questioning everything I once thought I knew. It started subtly, small incidents that could be dismissed as forgetfulness or coincidence. A door left ajar when I was certain I had closed it. Lights on that I distinctly remembered turning off. My husband, Daniel, seemed to be the one most affected. I would come home from shopping, only to find him pale-faced and tense, insisting he had heard the front door shut earlier, as though I had already arrived. But I hadn't. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he heard footsteps outside our bedroom door, only for us to find nothing upon investigation. Then, things escalated. One particular weekend, I went out with a few friends for a girls' night. I came home late to find Daniel visibly shaken. He swore that he had heard me return hours earlier, enter the front bathroom, and vomit. The sound had been so distinct that he had gotten out of bed to bring me a glass of water, only to discover that I was not home at all. The disturbances became more frequent. A chair pulled away from the dining table when no one had touched it. Toilet paper rolled down to the floor. Our dog, Max, barking at empty corners of the house. Then came the incident that made my blood run cold. Daniel woke me up in the middle of the night. Gasping in shock, he had felt someone kick him in the back. But it wasn't just a light tap. It was a forceful shove, as though someone beneath the mattress had tried to push him out of bed. Frantically, he looked under the bed, thinking Max had somehow gotten stuck there. But the dog was still sound asleep at the foot of our bed. By this point, fear had settled into the walls of our home. There was no tragic history tied to the house, no reports of deaths, no accounts of past hauntings. The previous owners, a couple in their late 70s, had lived here peacefully for over 2 decades before selling it to us. So why was this happening? One evening, desperate for answers, I stayed up late scrolling through old property records and community forums, searching for any clue about what could be causing these disturbances. That's when I stumbled upon an old discussion thread in a forgotten corner of the internet. A woman, who had lived in the area long before us, mentioned something peculiar about Willow Creek. According to her, before our neighborhood was built, the land had been a vast stretch of farmland, and on that land, there had been a house where a woman named Eleanor Sinclair had once lived. Eleanor had been a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors, and when she died, she had no surviving family. Her home had been demolished, the land sold, and new homes built over it, including ours. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Some neighbors had experienced similar events, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, shadowy figures glimpsed in the periphery of their vision. It was as though Eleanor was still here, determined to confront whatever presence lingered in our home. I did something I never thought I would. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Claire, who had experience dealing with hauntings. She agreed to visit our home the following weekend. When Claire arrived, she walked through our house in silence, occasionally pausing as though she were listening to something just beyond our ability to hear. Then, she turned to us with a grave expression. "This house isn't empty," she said softly. "There's something here, something that doesn't want to be ignored." Claire suggested we conduct a session to try and communicate with the presence. My hands trembled as we sat around the dining table, a single candle flickering in the dim light. "If there's someone here with us," Claire called out, "can you give us a sign?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Silence hung in the air. And then, the candle flickered violently. A sudden, loud thump echoed from the hallway. My heart pounded as I gripped Daniel's hand. Claire continued, her voice steady. "Eleanor, if that's you, we mean you no harm. This is our home now. But we acknowledge you." The temperature in the room dropped drastically. And then, just as suddenly, everything fell still. After that night, the disturbances lessened. The lights no longer flickered as frequently. The strange noises diminished, and Daniel no longer woke up feeling as though something was in the room with him. Perhaps acknowledging Eleanor was enough. Perhaps she simply wanted to be recognized, to not be forgotten. I still don't know if I fully believe in ghosts, but I do believe that something lingers in our home, something that was here long before we were. And while I no longer feel afraid, I know, deep down, that we are not alone. Hauntings often defy logic, leaving those who experience them searching for answers that may never come. Whether spirits are real or simply residual echoes of the past, what happened in Willow Creek House was undeniably real to us. Perhaps some souls remain bound to places they once called home, refusing to be forgotten, and perhaps all they want is for someone to listen. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. If you have your own paranormal experience, we'd love to hear about it. Send us your stories via the email in the description below. We'll be back soon with another eerie tale. So stay tuned, and until next time, sleep tight.